My parents sold their house of more than 3 decades to save my sister. They gave her everything from the sale, every dollar. And then, as if it were already decided and no one needed to ask, they told me they would be moving into my rental house. When I said no, they didn't argue, they didn't negotiate, they showed up anyway. That was the moment I understood this was never about helping my sister. It was about taking from me. I remember standing in my kitchen after that phone call, staring at the counter like it might explain what had just happened. My mother's voice was still ringing in my ears, light and relieved, as if she had just shared good news. They'd sold the house. Such a good price. A fresh start. She sounded proud, hopeful, almost giddy. And then, casually, like an afterthought she didn't think I'd question, she told me they'd given the money to Lauren. All of it. To help her get back on her feet, to save her before things got worse. I asked where they planned to live. There was a pause, not a thoughtful one, just long enough to confirm they'd already decided. My mother said they'd move into my rental house. She said it the way someone says the weather forecast. Like it was a fact of nature, not something that belonged to me. When I told her the house was occupied, that there were tenants with a legal lease, her tone changed. Annoyance crept in, sharp and familiar. She said I could ask them to leave. That family came first. My father got on the line then, his voice firm, reminding me of everything they'd done for me, everything they'd sacrificed. He said this was what families did for each other. I said no. Clearly, calmly. And that was when the silence hit. Not understanding, not compromise. Silence. I had been married to Ethan for 3 years at that point. He was the kind of man who listened more than he spoke, who believed in systems and boundaries and the idea that things worked best when everyone respected the structure holding them up. I built my interior design business the same way, slowly, carefully, from nothing. No family money, no shortcuts, just work. The rental house wasn't a luxury. It was security. It was something I'd built with intention, the way other people built retirement plans. The tenants were a young couple who treated the place like a home, not a stepping stone. They paid on time, they took care of the property, they mattered. But to my parents, the house wasn't a home with people in it. It was something I owned, something they believed they were entitled to. Lauren had always been the one who needed saving. She was older than me, louder than me, and constantly in some state of crisis. Growing up, every mistake she made came with an explanation. She was overwhelmed. She was misunderstood. She just needed support. When she struggled, my parents leaned in. When I succeeded, they nodded and moved on. Independence wasn't praised. It was expected. So when my mother said they'd sold their house to save Lauren, I wasn't shocked. I was just tired. What I didn't expect was the assumption that I would absorb the consequences without question. A few days passed without a word from them. No calls, no texts. That silence should have been a relief. Instead, it sat heavy in my chest. My parents were not the type to accept resistance quietly. Silence, with them, usually meant planning. I was at my desk one afternoon when my phone rang. It was the tenant from the rental house. His voice was tight, rushed. He said there were 2 people at the door claiming they were moving in. They had suitcases. They were telling him the house belonged to them now. I didn't need him to say who they were. As I drove across town, everything slowed down. Traffic lights felt too bright. My hands were steady on the wheel, but my thoughts were racing. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't confusion. They hadn't asked again. They hadn't waited. They'd decided my answer didn't matter. When I pulled up to the house, I saw their car parked crooked at the curb, like they planned to stay a while. Suitcases sat near the front door. My mother was knocking hard, her movements dramatic, her voice loud enough for the neighbors to hear. My father stood back, arms crossed, watching the door like it owed him something. The moment my mother saw me, her anger disappeared. Relief replaced it instantly. She said thank goodness I was there. She said the tenants wouldn't leave. As if they were the problem. I asked her what she was doing. She said they were moving in, that they'd told me they needed somewhere to stay, that this was the only option left. My father said they'd been in temporary housing for weeks, waiting for me to come around, waiting me out. That was when it finally settled in. This wasn't desperation. It was pressure. They had engineered the moment. They had counted on me folding. I told them they were trespassing. The word felt heavy and final as it left my mouth. My mother started crying, loudly, talking about sacrifice, about how much they'd given for their children. My father lowered his voice and told me I was making things harder than they needed to be. The front door opened just a crack. The tenant looked terrified. He asked if everything was okay. My parents snapped at him like he'd insulted them. I stepped forward and told him not to worry, that I would handle it. I gave my parents a choice: leave or I would call for help. They stared at me like I'd betrayed them, like I'd crossed some invisible line. But I hadn't. They had, long before they showed up with suitcases. As they loaded their things back into the car, my mother cried louder, making sure anyone watching knew who the villain was supposed to be. My father muttered that this wasn't over. I watched them drive away, my chest tight, my hands shaking for the first time that day. I didn't know then how far this would go. I only knew one thing with absolute certainty. Saying no had changed everything. I didn't sleep much after that day. My parents driving away with their suitcases should have felt like relief, but instead it stirred up something older and heavier. Lying awake beside Ethan, I kept replaying my mother's words, the way she said they had no choice. I'd heard that phrase my entire life, always followed by my sister's name. Lauren had always needed saving. That was the story anyway. If you asked my parents, she was sensitive, unlucky, too trusting for her own good. Life happened to her, not because of her. Every problem came with an explanation, every failure with a reason that softened it just enough to justify stepping in again. Growing up, I watched the pattern repeat itself. Lauren would make a choice that landed her in trouble. A bad relationship, a risky decision. Money she didn't really have. My parents would rush in, voices low and urgent, talking about how she needed help right now. There was always a crisis, always a deadline, always a reason it couldn't wait. I was there too, always there. But I was never the one being discussed. I was the quiet presence in the background, the one they didn't worry about because I seemed fine. I was fine because I had learned early not to need anything. When Lauren struggled in school, my parents hired tutors and met with counselors. When I did well, it was treated like confirmation that everything was working as it should. When Lauren dropped out of a program halfway through, it was because she hadn't found her passion yet. When I talked about taking a risk, my parents warned me to be careful, to be realistic, to think about stability. They never said it outright, but the message was clear. Lauren was fragile, I was capable, and capable people were expected to carry more. As adults, that dynamic only sharpened. Lauren bounced from one plan to the next, always just on the edge of something better. My parents funded the transitions, smoothed over the gaps, told themselves they were buying her time. I built my life the opposite way, brick by brick, careful not to ask for help I knew wouldn't come without strings. When my mother said they sold their house to save Lauren, I wasn't shocked by the sacrifice. I was shocked by the assumption. The idea that I would automatically step in to absorb what they gave away felt less like a request and more like a test I was expected to pass without complaint. In the days after the confrontation, I started thinking back to all the times my parents had used the same language. She needs us more. You're stronger. You can handle it. They sounded like compliments when I was younger. Somewhere along the way, they became obligations. Ethan noticed the change in me before I said anything. He asked questions gently, never pushing. One evening, as we sat at the kitchen table, he said something that stayed with me. He said it sounded like my parents didn't see my strength as something to protect, but something to spend. That thought settled in my chest and stayed there. I tried to understand what kind of crisis could justify selling the only home my parents had ever known. The details they shared were vague. Lauren was under pressure. Things were complicated. There were consequences they wanted to avoid. Every explanation felt carefully incomplete, like a story told with missing pages. What stood out most was that no one had asked me before making the decision. Not once. They hadn't wanted my input. They had wanted my compliance. I realized then that this wasn't really about Lauren. Not entirely. It was about my parents' fear of failure. Fear that they had raised a daughter who couldn't stand on her own. Fear that if they didn't intervene one more time, the outcome would reflect on them. Saving Lauren wasn't just about helping her. It was about protecting the image they had built around her, and around themselves, and I was the easiest place to offload the cost. The more I thought about it, the clearer it became. They hadn't told me about the house sale until it was done. They hadn't discussed options. They hadn't asked if I was willing. They had decided first, and only then looped me in, expecting the familiar pattern to hold. I would bend. I always had. Except this time I hadn't. That was when the anger finally reached me. Not the explosive kind. The quiet kind that sharpens everything around it. I wasn't angry that they helped Lauren. I was angry that they had decided my life was flexible enough to be rearranged without my consent. I thought about the tenants again. About the fear in their voices. About the way my parents spoke to them, like obstacles instead of people. That was the moment I stopped questioning whether I was being too harsh. Protecting my boundaries wasn't just about me. It was about refusing to participate in someone else's entitlement. Late one night, I sat alone in the living room and admitted something I'd never said out loud. If my parents were willing to sell their house without a plan and show up at someone else's door with suitcases, they were capable of far more than I'd allowed myself to see. The story I'd been telling myself for years was that they meant well, that they just loved their children too much. But love that ignores consent isn't love. It's control dressed up as concern. I didn't know yet how this would end. I didn't know what my parents would do next, or how deep Lauren's situation really went. But one thing had become painfully clear. The moment I stopped being useful to their narrative, I became a problem they needed to fix. After I said no, everything went quiet. Not the peaceful kind of quiet, the kind that hums under your skin and makes you listen for sounds that aren't there. My parents didn't call, they didn't text. They didn't argue or plead or accuse me of being heartless. For a few days, it was as if the conversation had never happened. That should have reassured me. Instead, it set off every alarm I had. My parents had never been good at accepting resistance. When I was younger, silence usually meant they were regrouping, deciding how to reframe the situation so it looked reasonable again. They weren't the type to drop an issue. They were the type to wait until the moment felt right to push harder. I tried to focus on work. I buried myself in client meetings, fabric samples, deadlines. But my thoughts kept drifting back to the rental house. It had always been the quiet part of my life, the thing that didn't demand attention. Now it felt exposed, like a door I'd forgotten to lock. I checked the lease again even though I knew it by heart. Everything was solid, the tenants were protected. Legally, there was nothing my parents could do. But legality had never stopped them from believing they were entitled to something. A few days into the silence, my mother called. Her voice was softer this time, careful. She didn't mention the house directly. She asked how I was doing. Asked about work, about Ethan. The questions felt rehearsed, like she was easing into something. Then she said, almost casually, that it must be nice having that extra house. Such a blessing, she called it. I felt my stomach tighten. She knew exactly what she was doing, testing the ground, seeing if I would soften. I reminded her calmly that the house was rented, that nothing had changed. She sighed, a long, heavy sound meant to communicate exhaustion. She said they didn't have many options, that things were temporary, that Lauren's situation was delicate and time-sensitive. Every word was familiar, urgency without details, pressure without responsibility. I told her again that my answer was still no. The line went quiet for a moment, then she said she understood. But the way she said it told me she didn't. Understanding to my parents usually meant waiting for compliance. That night, Ethan asked me if I thought they would show up anyway. I wanted to say no. I wanted to believe that my parents would respect a clear boundary. But something in me hesitated. They already had the address. They knew the house. They knew I wasn't there every day. And they had convinced themselves that their need outweighed everyone else's rights. The next warning sign came from an unexpected place. One of the tenants mentioned in passing that someone had driven by the house slowly the day before. A car they didn't recognize. It might have been nothing. But the way they said it, uncertain and uneasy, stuck with me. I asked for a description. It matched my parents' car. That was when the unease turned into certainty. They were already acting as if my decision didn't exist. They weren't planning to ask again. They were planning to move forward and deal with my reaction later. When my father called the following afternoon, his tone was different. Not emotional, not pleading. It was firm, almost managerial. He talked about how stressful things had been for them lately, how much pressure they were under, how families had to pull together when times were hard. He spoke as if the move was inevitable, as if my role was to accept it gracefully. I interrupted him and said the word he didn't expect to hear: trespassing. There was a pause. Then he laughed, sharp and humorless. He said I was being dramatic, that we didn't need to involve outsiders in family matters, that I was making things more complicated than they needed to be. That was the moment I understood the shift. This wasn't about convincing me anymore. It was about asserting authority. They believed they had the right to decide, and my resistance was just an inconvenience. Ethan and I talked late into the night. He reminded me that boundaries only worked if they were enforced. That saying no meant being prepared to follow through, even when it was uncomfortable, especially when it was uncomfortable. I told him I was afraid of what that might look like, of what it would mean to draw a line my parents couldn't cross. He said something simple that grounded me. He said the line already existed. My parents were the ones stepping over it. The next morning, I woke up with a strange sense of anticipation, like something was about to happen, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. My phone sat on the nightstand, silent but heavy with possibility. When it rang a few hours later, I knew before I answered. It was the tenant. His voice was tight, controlled in that way people sound when they're trying not to panic. He said there were 2 people at the front door claiming they were moving in. They had suitcases. They were insisting the house belonged to them now. I asked him to describe them, even though I didn't need to. When he did, the last piece clicked into place. They hadn't waited. They hadn't respected my answer. They hadn't even warned me. They had decided that my no didn't count. As I grabbed my keys and headed for the door, one thought kept repeating in my mind. This was no longer a disagreement. It was a test of how far they could go, and they were about to find out I wasn't the same person they thought I was. The call came in the middle of the afternoon, right as I was reviewing samples at my desk. I almost let it go to voicemail. Almost. Something in the tightness of my chest made me answer. It was one of the tenants from the rental house. His voice was low and rushed, like he didn't want to be overheard. He told me there were 2 people at the front door saying they were moving in. He said they had suitcases. He said the woman was insisting the house belonged to them now. I asked him to repeat himself, not because I didn't hear him, but because I needed the words to slow down. He did. Nothing changed. I asked who they were. "They said they're your parents," he said. I told him not to open the door, not for any reason. I told him I was on my way. Then I hung up, grabbed my keys, and walked out without even shutting my computer down. The drive felt unreal, like I was watching it through glass. Every red light felt personal. My hands were steady on the wheel, but my thoughts were racing ahead of me, lining up everything I already knew. This wasn't confusion. This wasn't desperation. This was a decision they had made long before they showed up. By the time I turned onto the street, the dread had hardened into something colder. Their car was parked at the curb, crooked and careless, half blocking the driveway like they planned to stay a while. 2 large suitcases sat on the porch, along with a couple of shopping bags. My mother was pounding on the front door with the flat of her hand, her movements sharp and dramatic. My father stood a few feet back, arms crossed, jaw set, watching the door like it owed him something. I parked and stepped out of the car. The moment my mother saw me, her anger vanished. Relief washed over her face so quickly it was almost impressive. She called my name like I was rescuing her, not the other way around. She said thank goodness I was there. She said the tenants wouldn't leave. I took a breath. Then another. I asked her what she thought she was doing. She gestured at the door, impatient now that I was present. She said they were moving in. She said they'd told me they needed a place to stay. She said it like the conclusion was obvious. I told her again that I had said no. My father stepped forward then. He said they'd been staying in temporary housing for weeks, that they'd been waiting for me to come to my senses, waiting me out. He said it without shame, like it was a reasonable strategy. Something in me snapped into focus. That wasn't desperation, that was pressure. They had timed this, chosen the moment when it would be hardest for me to say no again. They had counted on embarrassment, on guilt, on my instinct to smooth things over. I told them this didn't change anything, that the house was occupied, that they were trespassing. My mother's face tightened. Then she started crying, loudly, talking about sacrifice and everything they'd given for their children. She raised her voice just enough to carry, making sure anyone nearby could hear how ungrateful I was being. My father tried a different approach. He lowered his voice, stepped closer, told me we didn't need to make a scene, that we could handle this privately, that involving outsiders would only complicate things. That was when the front door opened a few inches. One of the tenants stood there, pale and tense, like he'd been holding his breath for too long. He asked if everything was okay. He asked if he should call someone. My parents turned on him instantly. My father snapped that this was a family matter. My mother said he was overreacting. I stepped between them and the door. I told the tenant he didn't need to do anything, that I would handle it. I told him he was safe and that he had done nothing wrong. Then I turned back to my parents and said the word they had been pretending didn't apply to them. Trespassing. My mother stared at me like I'd slapped her. She asked if I was really going to make my own parents homeless. I told her they weren't homeless. They had chosen to sell their house and give the money away. That didn't give them the right to take mine. She cried harder. She said a good daughter wouldn't do this. She brought up my grandmother, like she always did when she wanted to cut deeper. I told her my grandmother had taught me not to bully people, and not to steal. My father's face darkened. He asked what they had ever done to deserve this. He listed raising me, feeding me, giving me a roof over my head. I told him that was the legal minimum, and that it didn't entitle him to mine. The street felt suddenly very quiet, like it was holding its breath with us. I gave them a choice. Leave now, or I would call for help. I said it calmly, clearly, no anger, no apology. They stared at me like they couldn't believe I would actually do it. My father muttered that this wasn't over. He grabbed one of the suitcases and shoved it toward the car. My mother cried loudly as they loaded their things, making sure anyone watching knew exactly who she wanted them to blame. When they drove away, the silence rushed in all at once. The tenants opened the door fully then. They were shaken, apologizing for things they hadn't done. I apologized to them instead. I gave them my number and told them to call me immediately if my parents came back. I told them I would understand if they wanted to leave early. They didn't. They just wanted peace. I watched them close the door, my legs finally starting to tremble. As I got back into my car, one thought settled heavily in my chest. My parents hadn't crossed a boundary by accident. They had crossed it because they believed I would let them, and now they knew I wouldn't. The fallout started the next morning. My phone rang just after 7, dragging me out of a shallow, restless sleep. I didn't recognize the number, but I answered anyway. It was my aunt, speaking in a careful, wounded tone, like she was the first to volunteer for a difficult conversation. She didn't ask if I was okay. She didn't ask what had happened. She asked how I could do that to my parents. Before I could respond, she launched into a speech about sacrifice and respect, about how my parents had given everything for their children, about how family didn't abandon family no matter how uncomfortable things got. When I tried to explain, she cut me off. She said she didn't need the details, she already knew enough. By the time I hung up, there were 3 missed calls and a handful of messages waiting. Cousins I barely spoke to, an uncle who lived states away, even someone I hadn't heard from in years. Different voices, same script. The words blurred together until they sounded rehearsed. What stunned me wasn't the judgment, it was the certainty. Every single person spoke as if they knew exactly what had happened, as if my parents' version of events was the only one that mattered. Not one of them asked about the tenants. Not one of them asked why the house had been sold. Not one of them wondered why my parents had shown up unannounced with suitcases. By noon, I had stopped answering the phone. The messages kept coming anyway. Long paragraphs soaked in guilt and obligation. Reminders of everything my parents had done for me. Accusations that I was choosing property over people, money over blood. One cousin even claimed my parents were basically homeless now, stranded because of my stubbornness. That was the moment something clicked. I scrolled through the messages again, slower this time. Not one of them offered to help. Not one of them said my parents could stay with them. They all had opinions. None of them had solutions. When my aunt called again that afternoon, I answered. I asked her a simple question. If she was so worried about my parents, why didn't they stay with her? There was a pause. Then excuses. Not enough space. Bad timing. Health issues. She said I was in a better position to help. I had more room, more flexibility. I told her I didn't have room. I had tenants. She sighed, frustrated, and said that was different. It wasn't different. It was just inconvenient for them. That conversation stayed with me long after I hung up. This wasn't about family values. It was about punishing me for refusing to absorb the consequences of decisions I didn't make. I had broken an unspoken rule. I had been capable, responsible, and quiet for too long. And now that I wasn't, I was being corrected. By Wednesday night, I was exhausted. Not just physically, but emotionally. The constant judgment, the rewriting of reality, the way my role was being defined for me without my consent. I sat at the kitchen table long after Ethan went to bed, my laptop open, the house quiet around me. I started writing. At first, the words came out rough and angry. I deleted whole paragraphs and started over. I didn't want this to be emotional. I wanted it to be undeniable, calm, factual, impossible to twist. I wrote out the timeline. My parents sold their house. They gave the money to Lauren. They informed me they would be moving into my rental house without asking. I said no. I offered to help them find other housing. They refused and showed up anyway, harassing my tenants and attempting to force their way in. I attached screenshots of messages, a copy of the lease, proof of ownership. I included dates and details, not opinions or accusations. I didn't insult anyone. I didn't defend myself. I just told the truth. Then I wrote the last paragraph. I listed the names of everyone who had called or texted me about family duty and loyalty. And I wrote that since so many people were concerned about my parents' living situation, I was confident one of them would be happy to take them in. I asked them to let me know who would be hosting and when, so I could pass the address along. I stared at the screen for a long time before hitting send. It was late when I finally did. Late enough that I knew most people wouldn't see it until morning. Late enough that there was no taking it back. When I closed the laptop, my hands were shaking, not from fear, from release. The next morning, my phone was silent. No angry calls, no dramatic messages, no lectures. I checked it twice, then a third time, half expecting it to explode with responses. It didn't. The quiet was so complete it felt unreal. Around noon, the replies started trickling in. The first kind were polite deflections. People suddenly remembered they didn't have the space after all, or the timing wasn't right, or they were dealing with things of their own. The second kind didn't respond at all. No acknowledgement, no apology. Just silence. The third kind doubled down. My uncle sent a long message about betrayal and dishonor. about how I was tearing the family apart and turning my back on the people who made me who I was. He accused me of being cold, selfish, and ungrateful. I replied with one sentence. "What's your move-in date?" He never answered. The family group chat went quiet. Posts disappeared. Conversations stalled out. The moral outrage evaporated the moment it came with responsibility attached. By Friday, the calls had stopped. I sat with that for a while, letting it sink in. The truth had done what it always did. It exposed the difference between what people said they believed and what they were actually willing to do. I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel proud. I felt clear. For the first time, the narrative wasn't being controlled by whoever spoke the loudest. It was written down, documented, out in the open. And whatever came next, I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't going to carry this alone anymore. The silence after the email was unsettling. I had expected anger, accusations, a flood of messages demanding explanations or apologies. Instead, there was nothing. No calls from my parents, no messages from Lauren. Even the relatives who had been so vocal went quiet. It felt less like resolution and more like the pause before something else broke. A few days later, the first crack appeared. It came from a cousin I trusted just enough to listen to. She didn't call. She texted, careful and brief, asking if I was okay. Then, almost as an aside, she mentioned that things weren't going well with Lauren, that the money hadn't solved what it was supposed to solve, that, if anything, it had made things worse. I asked what she meant. Her reply took longer this time. When it came, it was fragmented. Lauren's situation wasn't just messy, it was urgent. There were deadlines my parents hadn't told me about, obligations they hadn't planned for, agreements that had been made in panic, not strategy. The house sale hadn't been a thoughtful decision. It had been a last resort. That was the moment the story shifted for me. My parents hadn't sold their house because they had a plan. They sold it because they were afraid. Afraid that if they didn't act immediately, the consequences of Lauren's choices would become public, permanent, undeniable. They hadn't been rescuing her. They had been buying time. And they had counted on me to absorb the rest. As more pieces fell into place, the picture grew darker. The money had gone quickly, faster than anyone expected. Problems that were supposed to disappear had only multiplied. New complications surfaced, ones that couldn't be fixed with a check or a promise. The urgency that had driven my parents to such extremes hadn't eased. It had intensified. I felt a surge of anger, sharp and hot. Not at Lauren, not even entirely at my parents. At the way I had been deliberately kept in the dark. At how they had made irreversible decisions, and then framed my refusal to clean up the aftermath as cruelty. They hadn't asked for my help because they knew I might say no. So they removed the choice altogether. That realization hurt more than the confrontation at the rental house. It reframed everything: the guilt, the pressure, the assumption that I would step in. They hadn't been surprised by my resistance. They had been inconvenienced by it. A few days after that, my mother finally called. Her voice sounded different. Tired, stripped of the sharp edge it usually carried when she was sure of herself. She didn't accuse me this time. She didn't raise her voice. She asked how I was doing, and for the first time, the question didn't feel like a setup. She talked around the issue at first. About stress, about how hard the last few weeks had been, about how things hadn't turned out the way they hoped. She said they were just trying to figure out next steps. I listened without interrupting. Eventually, she paused, waiting. I knew that pause. It was the space where I was supposed to offer something. Advice, resources, a solution. The role I'd always played without realizing it. I didn't fill the silence. When she finally spoke again, there was a subtle shift in her tone. Less certainty, more probing. She asked if I had any thoughts about what they should do now, if I had any ideas, any suggestions. There it was. Not an apology, not accountability, a search for a new angle, a way back in. I told her I didn't have any solutions to offer, that they had made their choices. that Lauren would have to face the consequences of hers, and that I wasn't going to step in to delay them anymore. She didn't argue. She just sighed, long and heavy, like she wanted me to feel the weight of her disappointment. After the call ended, I sat in silence for a long time. I felt grief then, unexpectedly sharp. Not for what was happening now, but for the story I had clung to for years. The belief that if I just explained myself well enough, my parents would understand. That reason would win out over fear. But fear had been driving this from the start. I talked it through with Ethan that night. He listened, as he always did, then said something simple that grounded me. He said you can't save someone who refuses to change, and you can't keep sacrificing yourself to make other people comfortable with their own choices. That was when I finally let go of the idea that this could have ended differently if I had just tried harder. My parents hadn't sold their house because they had no other option. They had sold it because they were unwilling to let Lauren experience the full weight of her decisions. And when that gamble failed, they looked to me, the same way they always had, to catch what fell. But this time I wasn't there to catch it. The next message came 2 days later, brief and telling. My father asked if we could talk soon, not to apologize, not to explain, just to talk. I stared at the screen, feeling a calm settle over me that I hadn't expected. Whatever conversation he wanted to have wasn't going to change anything. The truth was already clear. When the rescue failed, they were looking for someone else to pay the price. And for the first time in my life, I was ready to say that it wouldn't be me. They showed up again on a Saturday morning, just as Ethan and I were finishing breakfast. I knew it before I even looked at the doorbell camera. There was a familiar tightness in my chest, the kind that came from years of pattern recognition. When I opened the app, there they were. My parents stood on the porch, dressed neatly, my mother holding a small bouquet of flowers, my father carrying a paper bag from a grocery store. They smiled straight at the camera like they were posing for proof. My mother waved and said my name softly, the way she used to when she wanted something without sounding like she wanted anything at all. She said they knew I was home. She said they just wanted to talk. Ethan looked at me and didn't say a word. He didn't have to. We both knew what this was. It wasn't an apology. It was a reset. I stayed where I was. Outside, my mother kept talking, her voice carefully unsteady. She said they'd been thinking a lot. She said the last few weeks had been painful for everyone. She said mistakes were made on all sides. The word choice was precise. Mistakes, plural, shared. My father held up the grocery bag, angling it toward the camera. He said they brought food. He said my mother wanted to cook that pot roast I used to love. Nostalgia, served warm and familiar. I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it was so predictable. Flowers, food, memories, props designed to make it easier for me to forget everything that had happened. They stood there for several minutes, taking turns speaking, filling the silence I refused to break. My mother wiped at her eyes, making sure the camera caught it. My father's tone stayed calm, measured, reasonable. They talked about family, about how life was too short for this kind of distance, about how they didn't want things to stay broken. What they didn't talk about was accountability. They never said they were wrong to sell their house without a plan. They never apologized for showing up at the rental property. They never mentioned the tenants. They never acknowledged the fear they'd caused or the boundaries they'd crossed. Eventually, my father's patience thinned. His voice sharpened just enough to remind me who he was when charm didn't work. He said this was ridiculous, that we were adults and should be able to talk face to face. He said I couldn't keep shutting them out. That was the moment I understood there was nothing left to explain. I opened the door just long enough to step onto the porch. I didn't invite them in. I didn't take the flowers. I stood between them and the house, my feet planted, my voice steady. I told them we could talk, but not the way they wanted. I told them I wasn't reopening the conversation about housing. I wasn't fixing Lauren's situation. And I wasn't pretending the last few months had been a misunderstanding. My mother's face tightened. She said they had nowhere else to go. She said things hadn't worked out the way they expected. She said they were just asking for a little help. Temporary help. There it was. The real ask. The same one, dressed up differently. I told her no. The word landed heavier this time, not because it was new, but because it was final. I explained that my answer hadn't changed, that I wouldn't house them, that I wouldn't step in to buffer the consequences of choices they kept making for Lauren, and that I wasn't going to sacrifice my stability to maintain a version of peace that only ever benefited them. My father's expression shifted from disbelief to anger. He said I was being cold. He said I was punishing them. He said I was choosing principles over people. I told him I was choosing reality. I said I loved them, but I wouldn't be manipulated anymore. That helping wasn't the same as enabling, and that refusing to be used didn't make me a bad daughter. My mother started crying again, this time without performance. She asked how I could live with myself knowing they were struggling. She asked how I could sleep at night. I told her I slept better than I had in years. That answer stunned her into silence. I explained calmly that I had spent most of my life carrying responsibilities that were never mine to begin with. That I had been the strong one because I was expected to be, not because it was easy. And that strength didn't mean endless sacrifice. I told them if they needed help finding resources, they could look for them the same way anyone else did. But they would not be living with me. Not now, not ever. The air between us felt thick, charged. My father opened his mouth to argue, then stopped. For the first time, he seemed to realize there was no angle left, no leverage, no guilt strong enough to bend this. He picked up the grocery bag slowly. My mother clutched the flowers, then lowered them, defeated. They looked smaller somehow, stripped of the certainty they'd carried for so long. My father said this wasn't how families treated each other. I said families shouldn't treat each other the way they had treated me. They left without another word. I watched them walk down the path and disappear from view, my heart pounding, my hands steady. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt resolved. Inside, Ethan wrapped his arms around me and held me while the adrenaline drained away. I realized then that this was the moment everything truly ended. Not with shouting, not with police or lawyers, but with clarity. They had come back expecting access. They left understanding they no longer had it. For the first time, the cycle was broken, and I knew that whatever came next, it would happen without me standing in the middle, trying to hold everyone else together at my own expense. The weeks after my parents left were quieter than I expected. At first, the silence felt unfamiliar, like moving into a house where the background noise you'd lived with for years was suddenly gone. No calls asking for favors. No updates delivered with urgency. No sense that something was about to collapse if I didn't step in. Just space. Actual space. It took me a while to realize how tense I'd been before. How much of my energy had gone into anticipating problems that weren't mine to solve. Without that constant vigilance, my days felt lighter, not easier exactly, but clearer. I didn't hear much about my parents after that. What I did hear came secondhand and in fragments. They were figuring things out, adjusting, dealing with consequences they hadn't planned for. Lauren was still struggling, but for the first time there was no dramatic rescue underway. No sudden infusion of money or housing to soften the impact. I didn't feel satisfaction hearing that. Just a quiet acknowledgement that reality was finally doing what it was supposed to do. Ethan noticed the change in me before I did. One evening, as we were cleaning up after dinner, he said I seemed calmer, more present. I realized he was right. I wasn't carrying conversations in my head anymore, rehearsing arguments or justifications. I wasn't bracing for the next emergency. The rental house returned to being what it was meant to be. A responsibility, yes, but also a promise I'd made to myself. The tenants stayed. They felt safe again. That mattered more to me than I'd expected. It reminded me that boundaries don't just protect you, they protect everyone connected to your choices. Work settled into a steady rhythm. Projects moved forward. Clients came and went. There was comfort in that normalcy, in knowing that my life wasn't defined by chaos, even if it had been shaped by it. Every now and then, I felt a flicker of sadness. Not for what I'd lost, but for what I'd hoped might exist. the version of my parents who could hear me, the family dynamic that could adapt instead of demand. Letting go of that hope was its own kind of grief. But grief, I learned, doesn't mean regret. I thought a lot about what family had meant to me growing up: sacrifice without limits, silence as loyalty, endurance as proof of love. Those ideas had been passed down like rules you didn't question. Breaking them felt wrong at first, like stepping out of line. Over time, I started to see them differently. Love without respect isn't love. Help that erases consent isn't kindness. And being the strong one doesn't mean you're required to carry everyone else forever. The hardest truth to accept was that saying no hadn't destroyed my family. It had revealed it. The dynamics were always there, the expectations, the imbalance. All my refusal did was stop hiding them. I didn't cut my parents out of my life in a dramatic way. I didn't announce anything or draw up ultimatums. I simply stopped making myself available for manipulation. I stopped explaining my decisions to people who weren't listening. I let the silence exist. And in that silence, something unexpected happened. I found peace. Not the kind that comes from winning or proving a point. The kind that comes from alignment. From knowing your actions match your values. From no longer betraying yourself to keep others comfortable. If you're listening to this, and parts of it feel familiar, you're not alone. Many of us are raised to believe that love means compliance, that family obligations are infinite, and that setting boundaries makes us selfish. It doesn't. It makes us honest. If you've ever been the strong one, the reliable one, the one everyone turns to when things fall apart, you know how heavy that role can be. You know how easy it is to lose yourself while holding everyone else together. You're allowed to step back. You're allowed to say no. You're allowed to choose stability over chaos, even when that choice is misunderstood. If this story resonated with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever been put in the position of fixing problems that weren't yours? How did you handle it? Sharing your experience in the comments might help someone else realize they're not alone. And if you find comfort in stories like this, stories about family, boundaries, and finding your way back to yourself, consider staying a while. Subscribing means you won't miss the next one, and it helps this channel reach others who need to hear that choosing peace isn't abandonment. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do isn't to save everyone else, it's to finally save yourself. This story is fictionalized for dramatic effect.